first chapters are extremely important and also very interesting. Along with my good friend and fellow author Ruth Wilson, we are going to be discussing the 6 opening chapters of Jane Austen's novels. We'll be looking at the books in published order, which means that the first chapter that we're going to be discussing comes from Jane Austen's 1811 novel, Sense and Sensibility. Jane Austen wrote this book many years earlier in a draft that is thought to be known as Eleanor and Marianne, but she struggled to get her book published. So it was only in 1811 that she reworked it, retitled her novel, and it finally appeared in print. Now, first chapters and first lines are hugely important. They introduce the reader to the characters, they will set the scene, they might give an indication of the themes and important concerns of the novel, and of course they need to be enticingly written so that the reader is drawn to continue the story. So Jane Austen, of course, is particularly famed for the opening chapter of Pride and Prejudice, but Sense and Sensibility's first chapter is also an extremely interesting one. What do you think of the opening chapter of Sense and Sensibility, Ruth?
Well, Susannah, like you, I find first chapters absolutely fascinating. And whenever I'm in a bookshop and I come across a contemporary novel or a new novel that I'm thinking of reading, I hope that I'll have long enough before the shop assistant comes up and asks me if I want to buy the book to at least glimpse part of that first chapter. And I find the first chapter of Sense and Sensibility absolutely fascinating. It is so different, as each first chapter that Austen has written is different from each other chapter. This one, the first published book, as you said, has a very interesting history in that it developed from obviously letters between 2 sisters to some other form in the earliest revision and then the later revisions. I always wish that we had copies of the different revisions and the different manuscripts of this one. I think we would have learned so much from it about how Austen's brain worked and how she reworked her earlier versions. But what I would like to do, Susannah, is read a tiny passage from that first chapter, because the thing that strikes me about the first chapter of Sense and Sensibility is its pace and its tempo. It is slow, it is deliberate, it is giving you a lot of information, and maybe we'll come back to that information later. But may I read you just a little bit?
Please, go ahead.
It's the 3rd paragraph, and it starts off with a reference to the old gentleman. Now, I only read very recently that the old gentleman, and that is the old man who did not leave his money to the son, the nephew who deserved it. The old gentleman is actually a term that was often used for the devil. And I'm not quite sure whether Jane Austen meant that or not. Nevertheless, listen to this. The old gentleman died. His will was read, and like almost every other will, gave as much disappointment as pleasure. He was neither so unjust nor so ungrateful as to leave his estate from his nephew, but he left it to him on such terms as destroyed half the value of the bequest. Now, isn't that slow and stately? And you have the feeling that this is going to be a novel with gravitas. What do you think?
I agree. I think it is a fabulous little description. I had never thought about that connection of the old gentleman and the devil, but I think there's definitely something there that's really interesting to consider. But yes, it introduces, even in that tiny bit that you just read, Ruth, it introduces so many of the important themes of the novel. And we know from this that inheritance and money and who gets things and who doesn't get things is going to be a very important part of this book. And it's as a result of that will that those women lose their home. They are sent out into the world to find somewhere else to live. And of course, the whole plot of the novel comes from them losing their home. I agree with you, it is a slow chapter. I do know some people who have started off with Sense and Sensibility and got slightly confused as to which generation of Dashwood is being referred to, and finding that it's a little bit too slow and detailed. But I think it's full of Jane Austen's wonderfully sharp comments about people. She sums them up so quickly. And she really achieves an enormous amount in this first chapter. She tells us about the family of Dashwood, long settled in Sussex, so we know they're a very respectable family. We hear something about their estate. We learn about the will that makes sure that the girls, of course, don't end up getting anything. We learn about the girl's half-brother, John Dashwood, who is going to inherit the estate, although we've yet to meet his horrible wife. Then we learn, of course, about the Dashwood women. So Mrs. Dashwood, who is a widow as a result of her husband dying fairly young, and her 3 daughters. So we meet the heroines, Eleanor and Marianne, and we get a rather intriguing reference to a young girl called Margaret, who doesn't play a big role in this novel. Possibly she was there as a receiver of letters when the novel was in its epistolary form, but we can't be certain. She's only a young teenager, and she will never play a large role in the novel. But Jane Austen, in just 4 or so pages, really achieves an enormous amount, doesn't she, in
Absolutely.
the opening paragraphs of the novel?
She does, Susannah, and it strikes me that what you say is a key to everything. We learn so much in that first chapter. And I've made a little list of some of the things that we learn about, and I'm not suggesting for one moment that Jane Austen is didactic or that she's writing novels as conduct books or as lesson books. But the shrewdness of her observation is such, and the way she is able to convey it, they are such that in fact we do learn a lot. Now this is the list that someone made, and I haven't added to them, but I read it somewhere, of the things we learn about in Jane Austen novels. Marriage, courtship, family relationships, friendship, property, dowries, inheritance, entailment, loss, grief, heartbreak, dancing and entertainment, conduct protocols and manners. Now, isn't that extraordinary? So there is so much in this first chapter that actually touches on one or other of that long, long list. And I did come to the conclusion, and it's not an original thought, this novel has been referred to, a very big word, epistemological novel, a novel about what we know and what we don't know. And all through this book, we're seeing people think they know things and learning eventually that because they didn't know what was happening or they misunderstood or there was some sort of misrepresentation and they were misled, that they actually enter into behaviour that is not particularly productive for where they are. Particularly our dear sister, our dear friend Mariana, who feels she knows so much about poetry, so much about life at the age of 16, and has a lot to learn.
Isn't she a typical teenage girl who thinks she knows everything and the older generation knows absolutely nothing? It's a wonderful portrayal of Marianne, it really is. But Jane Austen, I think, in this first chapter also gives us characters who are incapable of ever learning anything. And one of those is John Dashwood. He's exactly the same character at the end of the novel as he is at the beginning. He doesn't think he has a single thing to learn, unlike his half-sisters, who of course learn a great deal in the course of the book. And I love the way in this first chapter that Jane Austen introduces us to John Dashwood. He was not an ill-disposed young man, unless to be rather cold-hearted and rather selfish is to be ill-disposed. But he was in general well respected, for he conducted himself with propriety in the discharge of his ordinary duties. It's such a wonderfully condemning sentence of John Dashwood. And we hear that he had he married a more amiable woman, he might have been made still more respectable. So Jane Austen's even giving us a hint of this woman who is going to appear so memorably in the second chapter, and of course be so eager to cut down her husband's promised gift of £1,000 a year to a basket of fruit and game when they are in season. in that utterly brilliant dialogue that we have. So Jane Austen, even with characters who have not yet been fully mentioned in chapter 1, is giving us a little hint of what is to come. She does it so superbly.
She does. And Susannah, this is one case where I would look to a film and say it's almost equalled the wonderful mischievousness of Jane Austen herself. That film that was written and directed by Emma Thompson, and the part of Mrs. John Dashwood was played by Harriet Walter, who really, I think, almost stole the scene from her husband. She became the very incarnation of everything that Jane Austen is trying to show you about the foibles, the vanity, the greed, the spite, the nastiness of the sort of people with whom she obviously mixed. I imagine she met people like that at the home of her brother, the grand home at Godmersham. She must have met so many people round and about at the assemblies in her period in Bath. And this chapter, I think, is it's more mischievous than ironical. I think the irony is really honed more when we get to the next novel, which will be such fun to talk about that one.
And don't you think that Harriet Walter must have had so much fun acting that part? You can just see how she's enjoying herself taking on the part of the really odious Fanny Dashwood.
And the beauty of it is the skill with which what Jane Austen actually wrote is honed into the dialogue and the way that Harriet Walter delivers those lines. And her face is extraordinary. I think it takes place in a carriage, that scene.
Yes, it does.
And the transition, as you say, from John really quite generously wanting to give those girls £1,000 apiece, and really ending up thinking, well, you know, a pheasant would be a very useful thing for them to have.
Although I'm quite certain that the basket of fishing game never actually eventuated. I think one of the things that we do get in this opening chapter of Sense and Sensibility is the sense of the importance of home. Now, the girls live at Norland Park. They have grown up there. It's been an important and much loved home to them. And suddenly, of course, they lose their home. And it's interesting to compare with some of the other novels. You know, in Emma has lived all her life at Hartfield, and she's barely ever left home, and that for her is a problem because her life has been so restricted. In Northanger Abbey, for young Catherine Morland, it's an adventure to leave home and go off to Bath. Poor Anne Elliot is forced out of her beloved home, Kellynch, because of her father's hopelessness with money. They need to go and rent a house in Bath. And young Fanny Price is transplanted from her real home to a new home. And the way in which the word home is used by Fanny changes in the novel. First of all, Portsmouth is home, and she talks about going home to Portsmouth. And then suddenly when she's in Portsmouth, home is Mansfield Park. So these girls lose their home in Sense and Sensibility. And a lot of the novel, I think, is them thinking about and longing for and eventually finding new homes. We hear quite a lot about Colonel Brandon's lovely estate and what's in store for Marianne when eventually she goes there. Edward, of course, fears that he's going to be sharing his home with Lucy as his wife at the parsonage, and Eleanor is deeply envious of that. She wants to be Edward's wife. So at the end of the novel, and the novel ends with the last sentences looking at the sisters' new home, and eventually Mrs. Dashwood joins them there, and they all live happily within the same neighbourhood. So I think home is very important, and Jane Austen is introducing that in this opening chapter.
Yes, and I think what you say, Susannah, about by the time you reach the end of the book, you have a completely new reverberation to that very short opening sentence. The family of Dashwood had been long settled in Sussex. It now occurs to the reader, this is a novel about exile, and exile has mythic proportions. And in a way, I think Sense and Sensibility has been somewhat underestimated in terms of the depth and profundity of where it really does take you as a leader, so that you move from the very happy life that the girls have, almost their paradise found in Norland, because that's where they've been invited, their exile, their suffering, their attempts to find not only a home, but partners with whom to share new homes, and then finally their absolute resettlement from being unsettled to being resettled, make it, I think, a profoundly interesting and quite philosophical novel, which has, I think in the family memoir there was some sense that maybe this novel did not have quite the stature of the others. But if you take the first chapter, read it to the end, and go back to the first chapter, and I think that's one of the fascinating things. You can't do it with every novelist, it's not fair. But with Jane Austen, at the end of the book, when you go back to the first chapter, which of course we do immediately we get to the end of the book, you've got another novel, and it's really reached depths which you didn't expect.
And that, of course, is why we have to reread Jane Austen, because you find something new every time. I think another thing that's interesting in this first chapter is that, Jane Austen is a comic novelist, and she very rarely includes death in her novels. But in this first chapter, we actually have two deaths. We have the old gentleman, and then we have Mr. Henry Dashwood, who dies really earlier than anybody expected, leaving his daughters not really provided for properly at all. And then later in the novel, we nearly get another death when Marianne is almost driven to suicide. She doesn't look after herself. She takes ridiculous risks in her misery over Willoughby. And there's an important moment in the novel when she says to her sister Eleanor, "Had I died, it would have been self-destruction." And she knows that she has been close to, committing suicide, which was a crime in Jane Austen's day. So again, in this first chapter with two deaths, and we have so few of them in Jane Austen's novels, we're getting a sort of prefiguring of how Marianne comes close to death later on in the novel. So that too, I think, makes it rather unusual in Jane Austen's opening chapters that we get these two deaths.
The other thing about Marianne, I find, Susannah, is how appropriate this is for young women, even in contemporary times. What young woman does not go through a period when her heart is broken? Very recently this happened to the granddaughter of a friend of mine, and I hesitated when she was crying and suffering and could not get back to a normal life as to whether I should invite her to borrow one of my copies of Sense and Sensibility. But I do believe that the portrayal of Marianne as a girl whose heart is broken, who has given her heart to a man whom she adores, and yet she is forced to recognise as inadequate for her love, undeserving of her love, that her sensibility has been exercised at the expense of her sense. And I think in that way it gives such wonderful meaning to the title itself, Sense and Sensibility, and we realise that it was never meant to be an either-or. Well, I don't think it was ever meant to be an either-or. Yes. It was balance. And I think that brings us in this first section where we get the description of Mrs. Dashwood, Eleanor, and Marianne. Margaret, as you say, I love the point you make that maybe she's just a leftover from the earlier letters, because I've never known quite what to do with her, and I think that's why in the Emma Thompson film, Emma found a different way to make use of her, and it was
did it wonderfully.
Yes. But do you agree Marianne is every girl's experience of heartbreak?
I think that's absolutely correct, and Jane Austen introduces her to us so wonderfully. Marianne's abilities were, in many respects, quite equal to Eleanor's. She was sensible and clever, but eager in everything. Her sorrows, her joys could have no moderation. She was generous, amiable, interesting. She was everything but prudent. And not many teenage girls are prudent. And yes, I think Jane Austen captures so wonderfully the sorrows of a teenage love affair gone wrong. poor Marianne thinks Willoughby is the one and only man ever for her. She doesn't have the judgment yet to work out that she will recover, she will move on. And there's that moment later in the book when she knows that she's lost Willoughby, and we hear that she almost screamed in agony. And it's very rare to get such a very strong response, in an emotional and physical response like that in a Jane Austen novel. But I think it's capturing that teenage, where everything is so intense. And as you say, a teenage girl today, the love affair's gone wrong, she sobs into her pillow, she can't talk to people, she won't eat. All of those symptoms that we see in Marianne are still in our world today with teenage girls.
And don't you think that gives a lie to everything that Charlotte Bronte criticised in Jane Austen's novels?
Totally.
I don't think there is anywhere, with all the suffering and all the anguish, and I really, I love Jane Eyre, and I think that Charlotte was a wonderful writer, but she wasn't a great reader, because she did not understand that there was the suffering, the anguish, the pain, but she was not writing, Jane Austen was writing a different sort of novel.
I totally agree. Charlotte famously commented of Jane Austen that the passions are entirely or virtually unknown to her. I forget the exact quote. And you cannot read of Marianne's suffering and think Jane Austen did not understand passion gone wrong. It's in her novels, it's understated. You don't need to have somebody tearing their hair out like Heathcliff or Mr. Rochester, clasping Jane to himself so tightly that it physically hurts her. You can get passion in all sorts of wonderful ways in Jane Austen. I've always loved the moment when Mr. Knightley takes Emma's hand and almost kisses it, but he doesn't. And there's so much in that moment that speaks of passion. You don't need the passionate kisses and the tearing of the hair that we might get in Charlotte Bronte. So I think Jane Austen, in the opening of Sense and Sensibility, gives us such vivid pictures of these two sisters and their mother and their half-brother and their family and their background and their financial circumstances. And she does it all so concisely, so accurately, and I think quite brilliantly. So in my view, it's a really wonderful first chapter.
And what you get from that little passage that you read out, Susannah, about moderation, here we get Jane Austen, the Aristotelian philosopher. Doesn't she do it subtly and beautifully? So much so that it was picked up in the beginning, only I think in that there was a wonderful review of, I think it was Pride and Prejudice by the Archbishop of Dublin.
Yes,
Richard
Whately.
Yes. And he already understands here is a woman who is embedding in these, to some extent, light-hearted romance courtship stories, the very essence of what Aristotle was saying about taking the middle way. Yes, I love Sense and Sensibility.
Well, it's been great fun discussing this first chapter with you, Ruth. And for our next podcast, we'll be moving on to one of the most famous first chapters in all of literature, beginning, of course, with that extremely famous first line, "It is a truth universally acknowledged." But I think that we'll end today by saying it's a truth universally acknowledged that first chapters are very important indeed, and that we've both had a lot of fun discussing the opening of Sense and Sensibility today.
It's been a lovely conversation, Susannah. More to come.